One is, why did the Archbishop of Turin change all the rules like that? The answer is, no one knows. He didn't tell anybody. He didn't have to tell anybody, and I don't know. I don't know why he did it. He was warned that changing things, if he veered from the protocol, and he didn't give anybody a heads up that he was going to do it. He was told beforehand that if he did change it, that it could affect the results. But he did. That's exactly what he did. So I don't know. My best theory, being charitable to him, is taking 7 different samples out of this thing from the middle of it. 7 samples from 3 different areas. I mean, where would you cut into it? All the areas that you're kind of willing to give up a little bit are really going to be the contaminated areas. You really want to cut right into here? It's a tough call. So, but probably for the purpose of the test, the wrong call, ultimately. So, the question we'll start off answering then is, if this thing really is older than 1260, then where was it before 1260? And so we're going to start right in your home court with a church father. How about that? This is we're going to start with a story that was preserved by the church father Eusebius. And Eusebius was out of Caesarea, and he was the biographer of Constantine. He was at the Council of Nicaea, and he wrote a very important church history at that time because there was a big library in Caesarea, probably brought over by the church father Origen from Alexandria. And so he had access to a whole lot of material that was since lost to us, and it's preserved in these long quotations by Eusebius. So he's really important for a number of reasons. But one of the things he talks about, he reserves a story about the King of Odessa, not Odessa, but Edessa. And Edessa is a city in southern Turkey that's now called Sanli Urfa, or just Urfa. And in the first century, the King of Odessa was a guy named Abgar. And Abgar he suffered from some kind of chronic illness. Other traditions tell us that it was leprosy mixed with arthritis, and he was in a lot of pain. And so he sent a messenger to ask Jesus to come back to Odessa and heal him. And Jesus, according to Eusebius, wrote a letter and sent it back to King Abgar and said, I can't come, but I will send somebody later. And shortly afterward, Jesus was crucified, and then Thomas, the Apostle Thomas, sent a disciple of Thaddeus, one of the 70 that Jesus had sent out, to Odessa, and he appeared before Abgar, and Abgar became a believer. There's no mention by Eusebius of any kind of image or shroud or anything like that. And I'm not saying that everything, he's just recording it. I don't think he does any commentary on it. So my personal conviction is that the letter part of this is legendary. But there is a strong tradition for it in Odessa. So there are a number of other stories that corroborate this afterwards. I'm not going to wear you down with all of the Image of Odessa stories, but the main story finally comes in 945. Let me find it here. And the story of the Image of Odessa is that, let's see, here we go, is that when the messenger from Abgar came to Odessa, he was also the king's painter. And he, Jesus wrote a letter, and then he washed his face, and he wiped it on a cloth, and his image was on it. It's like the story of the veiled Veronica. And then that is what is taken back to Odessa. And then Thaddeus wears it on his head when he appears before Abgar. And then Abgar puts it on his head, and that's when he's healed. But the other ways in which this is described, it really seems to be more of a full body sheet that is draped over him and then folded up and put in a box. So in the book, the story of the Image of Odessa that was published in 945, Abgar is healed, and he folds it around a board, and it's probably put in a box, a metal box with a window cut out in the shape of the face, so you see this face, and he put it in a niche above the city wall, because that was where a pagan idol was, and visitors to the city would pay tribute to the idol when they went in. So we had the pagan idol taken down, and he put up the image of Odessa right there for everybody to see. And then his son came to power, and his son shared the faith and left it there. And then the grandson came to power, and he reverted to paganism. And at that point, the priest of Odessa walled up the image because he thought the image might get destroyed. So he walled it up, and its location became lost. Although people of Odessa remembered that the image existed, they didn't know really where it was. And then in 544, the Persians came to conquer Edessa, and they laid siege to it. And during the siege, the Bishop of Odessa had a vision, and the angel told him to go get the image and where to find it. And so he went, he opened up the wall, and there was the image. And so he carried it around the city of Odessa, displaying it, and he got to a certain point, and there was a lot of copper pots hanging in this one particular spot, and they all started rattling. And that's how the people of Odessa discovered that the Persians were also tunneling under the city and were going to come up in it. So the people of Odessa dug a hole into the tunnel, poured in a bunch of oil, and set it on fire and burned the Persians, and that's how they survived the siege. And so at that point, the image of Odessa became very, very famous. All of a sudden, in 544, everybody knows about the image of Odessa. And it was kept in Odessa until 944, and that's when the Byzantine Emperor Romanus I had it taken to Constantinople. And this, of course, is where many of the relics of the historic Christianity were taken, and they were displayed and stored in the different palaces and in the churches there. And there was, in 1203, so it was there for 200 or 300 years. There was, in 1203, there was a Crusader who was in Constantinople who was visiting a bunch of the relics, and he kind of kept a diary or a travelogue of the stuff he was seeing. And he went to this church here, which is My Lady St. Mary of Bacharme. And this is on the Golden Horn. It's less than 2 miles from the Ecumenical Patriarchate, about 4.5 miles from Hagia Sophia. And this is the church complex, and that's where it was. And he went in there, and what he said was there was he said that's where they kept the Sinden, in which our Lord had been wrapped, which stood up straight every Friday, so that the features of our Lord could be plainly seen there, and no one, either Greek or French, ever knew what became of the Sinden after the city was taken. Now, Sinden, that's the Greek word for shroud, and so people who study the shroud are called Sindenologists. So he says it's standing up every Friday on display, so you know it's not just going to be a portrait of him that's getting flipped up like that. It's probably, there's folds all along the shroud that indicate that it was folded on a mechanism at some point, and that mechanism allowed it to be raised out of the box and then lowered back down. And so if that is what's actually going, that might describe what's going on here. That's might be where those folds came from. In April 1204, the Crusaders in the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople in like one of the darkest events in Christian history, where you have the Western Church attacking the Eastern Church, and they killed a lot of people and destroyed churches, stole relics, destroyed relics, and the image of Odessa at that point disappeared, and there's no evidence of it for 150 years. And when it showed up, it was in 1355 in Liry, France, and it was, and that's the first time it was displayed in Europe. And so this is the oldest universally accepted date for the existence of the shroud. And it was displayed in Liry, France, by a knight named Geoffrey de Charnay. And he had these commemorative medallions struck, and they look like this. So you can see, you know, an image of the Shroud here, and then he's got his family crest for him and his wife here. This was found under a bridge in the Seine in 1885, actually. So he never explained where he got this thing. He never explained where it had been for 150 years. He just started showing it. So there have been a couple of different theories for what happened between Constantinople and Larry, France. There's been more than a couple, but there are two good ones, and I'll tell you the two good ones. The first one is that it was brought to France by Othan de la Roche, who was a crusader in the Four Crusades, who then became the Duke of Athens. And from there, he returned home to Byzantium, France, and his great-great-granddaughter married Geoffrey de Charnay, the knight who displayed this for the first time. And if you go to the castle today in Byzantium, France, they have a box that has a little badge on it that explains that this was what kept the shroud that moved the image of Odessa from Constantinople. But if you don't buy into that story, there's another one, and it has to do with the Knights Templar, which is a little bit of a groaner because they get blamed for everything. But there's two really interesting facts about this one. The first one is that the Templars, in their secret ceremonies, they said they worshipped a bearded head, and nobody knew what that meant until 1951. In 1951, there was in Templecombe, England, there was a small building that had been in use by the Templars, and a strong wind came through and knocked some ceiling loose, and they were able to see the boards on the backside of the roof for the first time, and this is what they saw. And it has a very close resemblance to the man in the shroud. And if you don't believe that, then there's a lot more coming on that kind of resemblance thing. The second thing that's interesting is that when the Knights Templar were outlawed, and their leader, Jacques de Molay, was executed in Paris in 1314, standing right next to him, executed that same day, his chief lieutenant was Geoffrey de Charnay. But it's not the same Geoffrey de Charnay, because we're talking about 41 years earlier than the display of the Shroud in France for the first time. So we don't know if they were related or not. They spelled their name a little bit differently. N-A-Y is the Templar, just N-Y is the knight who displayed it. And Knights Templar had vows of chastity, so if he was actually true to that, it wouldn't have been a son, but it could be some other kind of relative down the line. So maybe there's some way that both the stories are true together. We just don't know. But kind of an interesting connection there. So, about 100 years later, the de Charnay family ran into some financial hardship, so they sold it to the King of Savoy. And Savoy at that time was an area in the southeast of France and northwest Italy, and the capital was Chambéry. So this is Chambéry, France. That's the cathedral there, and it stayed there for a couple hundred years. And in 1532, that's the church that caught on fire that made these triangular holes there. And this is where the nuns were that put all the patches and stuff on it. So about 45 years later, the King of Savoy moved his capital to Turin, and he put it in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. So this is where it's been since then, with the one exception of World War II, when it was in a monastery outside of Naples, and it's been there ever since. It was actually, we think of this as being owned by the Roman Catholic Church, but it wasn't owned by the Roman Catholic Church until 1983. It belonged to the King of Savoy. He just kept it in the church. But the last King of Savoy, the hereditary deposed king, died in 1983, and he bequeathed it to the Catholic Church. And so this is when the Archbishop becomes such a big deal. That's when he kind of takes control of it. So, this is the rough itinerary of what we see in the historical documents. And so I've got a question mark here in Athens. And so now the question is there any scientific evidence that corroborates the documentary evidence, and it turns out there is, and it's in the form of pollen. Because in the 60s and 70s, there was a criminologist, Swiss criminologist named Max Frey, and he had this kind of Sherlockian notion that he would try to place suspects and witnesses at certain scenes by taking sticky tape and pressing it against their clothes and comparing the pollen he found with the pollen in that area that he was trying to place them in. And so he got invited to do it to the Shroud. So he showed up with his sticky tape, and here he is, and he looks super happy about it. And he's got normal gift wrapping tape here. It's the like off-the-shelf Scotch tape. And he did this twice. He came in '73, and he came again during the Sturm investigation. And he took 38 different samples, and he was able to identify 56 different kinds of pollen embedded in the weave of the Shroud. And then he identified where that pollen came from. He could identify all the pollen, but what he identified was that it had been in, the pollen was from Italy, France, Turkey, the region around Istanbul, Palestine, and the region around Jerusalem. And the pollen from Jerusalem was in bloom, which only happens in March and April. How about that? That's pretty crazy. Amazing. I mean, there's no way you can fake that stuff. It's incredible. So I'll switch gears. I'll tell you about an entirely different line of evidence now from the existence of the Shroud prior to the 1260 date, and that's the Iconographic Theory. And the way this works is that in the 1930s, there was a French biologist who started to recognize that there were a number of features on the Shroud that were shared with depictions of Christ that he was trying to explain. He kept seeing the same features over and over and over and over again. But to kind of understand how this theory works, you got to understand what Jesus looked like in the earliest days of Christianity. So here are a number of images. I could have chosen a bunch of different images, but I've got catacomb images from first through 5th century here, 6th century. I've got a couple mosaics. That one's from 4th century Britain. This is 6th century Ravenna, Italy. This is a house church in Syria in the 4th century. So there's a bunch of, this is a little bit pixelated, but the point is that Jesus, there's no standardized way to depict Jesus in the early days of Christianity. A lot of times he's a repurposed Roman god. He is a good shepherd. He's a young boy. He's got long hair. He's got short hair. He's got beard. He's got no beard. And this one, he's holding a short staff. It's a kind of magic wand, which is how he's depicted often when he is shown doing a miracle. In that particular one, he's raising Lazarus from the grave. So there were so many different ways that Augustine actually complains about it in writing, about how there's a jillion different ways of depicting Christ. And then suddenly, everything started looking the same, and it looked like that. Okay? And the change happened in the middle of the 6th century. And so what this biologist had seen is that in these, especially the early Byzantine icons, you start to see features that correspond with the face of the Shroud of Turin. And there are things like, read that for a second. So you can see things like, don't want to draw on it. There are things like a little triangle between the eyes. You see that in most of these. You see the same kind of part in the hair. You see the way the tunic is formed there. Of course, he's not wearing a tunic, but there's these weird stains on it that they might be trying to make sense of. There's a forked beard that's in most of them. And when you compare it to the image on the Shroud, all of those things are on the face of the man in the Shroud. Now, the forked beard thing is interesting because the man in the Shroud probably does not have a forked beard. He probably has a long beard that is kind of dimpled as they put a cloth around him to hold his chin shut, like Marley's Ghost in A Christmas Carol. Okay, and that doubles it up. But it looks like it's dimpled, and you see it repeated all over the place. He's got one, his right eye is slightly larger than his left and slightly raised. So there's all sorts of interesting unique features about the man in the shroud that gets repeated and echoed in all of these icons. So this recovery of the image of Odessa in 544 explains why all of a sudden in the middle of the 6th century there appears to be an image of Jesus that people think is authentic and want to copy. And that's best explained with the recovery of the image of Odessa and the fact that it corresponds so close in so many features that you look at in the shroud, there's a connection there, there's a correlation there. So initially there were only like 15 things that people saw, and then this has become developed more over the last 100 years. The British historian Ian Wilson did a lot of work on this, but the most startling and compelling work was done in the 70s and 80s by a Duke psychiatrist, and he started comparing the earliest Byzantine icons with the face on the Shroud of Turin by overlaying them. So he got a couple of projectors, and he projected them on the same spot in the wall, and he had a polarizing lens on each one of the projectors, and then he held the polarizing lens, and he was able to isolate all of the areas where they match exactly. He calls them points of congruence. And so he took this image. This is the Christ Pantocrator icon that was the oldest Christ Pantocrator icon. It's from the monastery at St. Catherine's at the foot of the traditional Mount Sinai. It's been dated to 550, and the monks there told Dr. Wagner that it was rendered from Christ's burial shroud. So he overlaid these on top of each other, and he found 170 ways in which they agree. It's kind of hard to see when they're next to each other. So through the magic of Photoshop, we're going to do it. I'm going to overlay one on the other. And for reference, to start off with, keep your eyes on the point of the nose, on the tip of the nose, and everything else will read in. Exactly. Look at that eyebrows. Look at the eyes. Look at the hairline. You can see how this weird stain going on down there gets replicated in the tunic. It's pretty incredible. Here I got a different form of the overlay right here. I mean, that just looks like a painting that got worn away. It doesn't look even like an overlay. It looks like this just gets colored in a little bit. It's pretty stunning. Where the wounds hit, where the ears hit, where the beard hits, it's amazing. So 170 areas he documented. So then, are you good? Are you still taking pictures? Okay, all right. I want to give everybody a chance. If you want to take a picture, that's fine. He compared it to the oldest image of Jesus minted on coin. So this is from 695. It's called the Solidus. And so he did another overlay and discovered 145 points of congruence. And it looks like this. It just reads right in. I mean, so for due diligence, by the way, I did put in other faces and tried to do an overlay on the shroud. It does not work. So I'm not trying to be flip. It's crazy how much it matches, and you have to manipulate photographs in order to make someone else work. At least the people I tried. So let me tell you one other interesting kind of art-related thing, and that is this image, which is an image from 1195, so 65 years earlier than the oldest radiocarbon date. It's from a Hungarian trade manuscript, and it's a panel that shows the women discovering the empty tomb, and there's a shroud, but look at this crazy detail that they included. They've got these 4 dots, these 4 little circles there, just like on the shroud. It's the poker holes. Isn't that crazy? What a bizarre thing to include. The shroud didn't exist yet.
Is the what?
Right?
Sorry.
Poker holes. The holes made by the incense that had fallen on the shroud. Right here.
Right.
right? So it's repeated 4 times. So that's what they are. They're often referred to as the poker holes, even though they say they're burned through by embers. So that's really hard to explain if the shroud did not exist before 1260. The evidence is pretty compelling, but I'm going to add one more thing to it, and that is the other relic that we're able to study from a scientific point of view, and that is the Pseuderium of Oviedo. More people I've talked to here so far have known what this thing is that I never run into before. How many people know what the Pseuderium of Oviedo is or have heard of it? Okay, that's excellent. It's usually nobody. So Oviedo is a city in Spain. It's about 15 or 20 miles inland from the northern coast, right in the middle of the northern coast. It's this mountainous region called Asturias. And a Pseuderium is a sweat cloth. That's all it really is. And in the first century Roman Empire, it was pretty common to carry around this sweat cloth. And in Oviedo, Spain, they have this particular piece of linen that they believe was wrapped around Jesus' head while he died on the cross. And the idea, remember, is that the lifeblood contains the soul. And so when a Jewish person dies violently, they bury the blood with the body. So as Jesus was on the cross, they believed this was, and he was approaching death, this was wrapped around his head to collect the blood that came out of his mouth and his nose, and then was buried in the tomb with him, and was found by Peter. And you read that in John 20, verses 5 through 7. It says that, bending over and looking inside, he, John, saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not enter in. Then Simon Peter arrived, following him, and re-entered into the tomb, and he saw the linen cloths lying, and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head. So, I did my homework. That's from the patriarchal text, the English translation of the patriarchal text there, just for you guys, the EOB. So let me explain what is on here, because it looks like a dirty mess, which is really what it is. There is no image on it, because remember, if the image was created in that fall-through radiation hypothesis theory, the Pseuderium wouldn't have been on his head at that time. The Pseuderium would have collected the blood, been buried with the body, probably thrown to the side before they put the body on the shroud and then wrap the shroud up. So it's not on the body at the time of the resurrection. There's no mechanism for it to have any kind of image on it. So what you're looking at has been shown to be it's blood. There's a lot of dirt. There's some scorching on there, and there are these kind of concentric patterns or stains that get bigger as they expand out. Obviously they get bigger as they expand out. They get bigger as they get layered on top of each other. So the smaller, dense ones are in the middle, and then they get bigger as they go out. And so this area right here would be where the nose was, and they know that this was wrapped around a man because this is clotting in facial hair, which would necessitate a man. This is blood that would have run down the bridge and run up the bridge of the nose, and this would have pooled onto the forehead, and I will explain how that happens in a little bit. Then this is a big blood clot over here, and this is probably where it was the area where it was fixed to the back of the head, pinned to the hair. The man in the shroud has long hair, possibly a ponytail. Scholars are split on the ponytail part of that, but I will show that to you in a second. And so here's what they know about it. They know the blood is type AB, which is the same as the shroud. It's also common in the Middle East, but not common in Europe. Again, this is not all post-mortem blood. On the shroud, all you have is post-mortem blood. On the Pseuderium, there's lifeblood in addition to post-mortem blood. And the blood is a mixture of all of this. This isn't purely blood making these stains. There's also pulmonary edema, which is a fluid that is created when a body is under extreme duress or torture, such as asphyxiation, which is one of the ways in which you die in crucifixion. So it's the correct mixture for that, correct ratio. Now it looks like this is like a mirror image of this, and that's because it is. So looks like there is a kind of an axis point, and then this was folded on top of this area. And that is because the body, the head was probably lolled forward like this, and so as the Pseuderium was wrapped around, it hit the arm, and they folded it back for a time. And so the stain got doubled up like that. Let's see. There's the face from that sculpture I showed you, put in place so that you can see how everything starts to hit. So the tip of the nose is right in the center of that main area there. And you can see that thing right, this blood clot right there is what would be wrapped around the back of the head. And then this part right here is where it would have doubled back. So it would look like that's the position of the head. That's how it gets doubled back. While you're waiting, you got it? Okay. So, another interesting area is right here in the bottom left-hand corner above that big blood clot. There is a cluster of primarily what was lifeblood, and you can see that this odd pattern would be made by a number of kind of superficial, small pinprick type of wounds, such as by a crown of thorns. You can also see that right here, there are these pairs of tiny little pinholes from where the Pseuderium would be pinned through the hair in the back there. And that becomes an important pattern here in a minute. So scientists try to recreate the stains, and they discovered it takes 3 positions to create the stains you see on the Pseuderium. They did use 6 parts pulmonary edema and 1 part blood, and using that, they determined that it was put on the head when the head was in this position. That's when it was in. It was doubled back, and the head was in. It was on the body for about 45 minutes to an hour. And the reason you get these kind of spreading stains like that is because the man on the cross. Remember, if you're on the cross, you cannot exhale unless you lift the body weight off the lungs. And so the time between you're able to exhale is going to grow longer the closer you approach death, because you're running out of energy and the ability to raise yourself. And so the pressure would build up, he pushes up, and he spews out the blood onto the Pseuderium. Get caught in the Pseuderium as he goes back down, and now it's a long enough period where it starts to dry before he comes back up again. And he deposits some more. And that's how these stains grow and they spread. And he's in this position for about 45 minutes to an hour. So there are parts of the Pseuderium that have lifeblood on it, so it was put on when he was alive, but there's also post-mortem blood, so he dies during the time he's in this position. Then he's taken off the cross. The second position requires him to be laid face down on the forehead with his feet slightly elevated, which means the blood can then run down the nose or up the bridge of the nose and pool on the forehead. And I'll show you how that fits in just a second. And he's in that position for 45 minutes to an hour. And then the third position is face up, and he's in that position for only about a few minutes. So this makes sense of the biblical data. If you think about how once he's taken off the cross, if he's laying there for 45 minutes to an hour, that gives Joseph of Arimathea time to go give permission to have the body, to bury the body, and then the distance between Golgotha and the Holy Sepulchre is very small. You can easily walk it in just a minute or so. So flipping it face up and this being on his head in the face up position for only about 5 minutes or less, it makes sense of all of that. So now, because there isn't any image on the Pseuderium, there's not really as much to investigate, but they did in fact invite Max Fry to come to Oviedo with his gift wrap tape and take some pollen samples. And so he did. And he pulled out 30 different types of pollen from the Pseuderium. And he determined that the pollen was from Spain, North Africa, and the area around Jerusalem. And so the question then becomes, well, where did the Pseuderium come from? What's the story behind the Pseuderium? So here's the story behind the Pseuderium. There is actually a good bit of historical evidence that traces its root. I'm not going to bore you with all of it. If you want to go investigate it, it is there for you. But one of the earliest mentions is in a travelogue by Antonius Martyr. And this was written in about 570. And it's a travelogue when he went outside of Jerusalem to around the area where John the Baptist had his ministry. And Antonius Martyr writes, on the very bank of the Jordan is a cave in which there are 7 cells with 7 maidens, and in this place there is said to be a napkin. That was about the head of Jesus. Like I said, there's a bunch of different sources. I'm not going to bury you in it because I'm keeping you here longer than I get to anyway already. But the person who collects all of these sources and tells one long story, tells the whole story, is the Bishop of Obieno early in the 11th century. His name is Powell. And so in Leo's history, what happens is that he explains that the chest that the Pseuderium is kept in was made by the disciples of the apostles, and that's what was in the cave, along with a bunch of other relics that the nuns were guarding. And then in 614, the Persians were approaching Jerusalem to sack it, and so it got moved, and they moved it to North Africa, probably Alexandria. And then the spread of Islam moved into North Africa in 616, and so they put it on a boat and shipped it to Cartagena, Spain, and immediately took it over to Seville. And that's where it stayed until 657, and that's when Islam spread into Spain. So they had to move it north to Toledo, and Islam kept spreading. So by 711, they moved it again all the way to the most northern point in Spain there, into the region of Asturias. Oviedo didn't exist as a city. It got taken to a well on top of a mountain there called they call Monsacro now. And that's where the Muslims, it's one of the few areas in Spain that the Muslims were not able to conquer. And so the king of Asturias attributed that to the protection of the relics, and he founded the town of Oviedo and founded a cathedral, and he put the box in there. So this is the cathedral in Oviedo, Spain. I had never heard of Oviedo, Spain, but it's like 250,000 people. I think the Queen of Spain is from there, so it's not a small fry. This is not what was built in 761. This is what was built in 761. This is called the Camera Santa and the Holy Chamber, and this is where they have the Pseuderium to this day. So it looks like that if you go in there, and in a lot of relics, not all of them from the chest. I'm not sure any of them from the chest are on display. I'm unsure. But that is what the chest looks like, because when Palaio wrote his history in the 11th century, they opened it, they did an inventory, and then the king had it plated in silver and decorated. And so that's what's on display. Above it is a facsimile that they have there. It's not like the Shroud where they only pull it out every 20 or so years and have a big formal display of it. Instead, the Pseuderium is displayed 3 times a year, on Good Friday, and then there are 2 feast days in September. So here it is, they pull it out for the benediction. Strangely, the priest in this picture is holding it sideways. It's not like you can really tell what's on it anyway, but that's not how it would have been on his head. So, what makes this important, the reason why I'm telling you about this, is because it's so well provided. There's no doubt that it has been in Spain since at least 711, probably earlier, and therefore, if there's any kind of way to show a correspondence between it and the Shroud, it gives yet another really great reason for thinking that the medieval date of the Shroud is not accurate, or it doesn't refer to the main body of the Shroud. So, but if these things are authentic, there's no way, they haven't been in the same location since the 1st century, and they're never going to be in the same location in all likelihood. So we would have to rely on doing our overlay thing. So that's what we're going to do. So I have a close-up over here of the tops of the head. This is the back of the head here. And this is that wound cluster that probably reflects a crown of thorns. And then this is the long hair I was telling you about. And it's kind of got this funnel shape. So that's why some people think of it as a ponytail. And you're going to see that, and when I do this overlay, that blood clot is going to fit exactly right there. And this wound cluster, it almost won't even change. The wound cluster on the Pseuderium is so close to that, it's crazy. So that's what to keep your eye on when I do this in a second. But the other thing is, you'll see on the face, I'll do it, I'll put it on, I'll take it off a couple of times so you can see this, but you'll see the blood run down the bridge of the nose, and then you'll see that kind of weird square shape that pools on the forehead. You'll see it go right in there. It's pretty crazy. So, here it goes. So, watch the blood cluster. Just start with that. Ready? It just kind of colors right in. It just kind of gets darker. And so watch the blood clot right here. Let's see. Hold on, that's a spoiler. Forgive yourself. Okay, here we go. And now, okay, so see, here's the blood on the forehead. Here is the bridge of the nose. Here's everything catching in the beard, around the mouth, right in the nose. So watch that. Isn't that crazy? It's right there. So let me do a close-up. This is what we're going to overlay. So you can see this is the bridge of the nose thing right here. This wound right here is really interesting because you're going to see how it fits right here. But the most interesting thing here is this three-shaped squiggle of blood right there fits this, the contours of that. It's pretty amazing. So here's an outline of the features done on the shroud, and then showing how that outline maps to the stain we're about to overlay. And here it comes. So you look at the bridge of the nose, the forehead, loosen it a little bit on the screen, but you can see it really does fit. Watch this. Keep your eye right on that. It fits right on the edge of that thing. It's pretty amazing. So it's never going to be 100% exact match, because the man in the shroud was man in the Pseuderium was alive for at least some part of the time, and he's in 3 different positions, so he's moving. The man in the shroud is dead, so it's never going to be an exact match, but it's pretty startlingly close, I think. So now, because the Roman Catholic Church isn't allowing any more tests to be done on the shroud, this is just like yet another thing that as more people, as awareness of the Pseuderium grows, it might be another thing that helps compel the reopening of the investigation. It's kind of like a key that might help unlock the box so that we can look into the shroud a little bit more. As Father Gregory said before we ever got going, it's important to understand that these things don't prove that Christianity is true. Okay? The truthfulness of Christianity does not stand or fall on whether the Pseuderium and the shroud are authentic or not. But we have a historic faith. We believe in something that happened in real-time space history. And so these things corroborate that, and they're valuable for that reason alone. So we don't want to make too much of it, but at the same time, it's absolutely fascinating and can be used as a way of giving us some assurance in the history of it. But even more importantly, we hear so much about how that Jesus shed his blood for the forgiveness of our sins. And sometimes you can hear that so much, it starts to become a little bit abstract and lose its force, lose its impact. But if this is authentic, that's the blood shed for the forgiveness of your sins right there. it's a real thing. That's the blood of the covenant shed for many for the remission of sins. So, thank you for coming.